Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. The US President Donald Trump has called on the Justice Department to release all credible information from its probe into Jeffrey Epstein. Amid growing outrage from his MAGA base over alleged cover-ups, Trump, who once promised to reveal Epstein files, now claims the case is boring stuff. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has announced a trade deal with Indonesia imposing a 19% tariff down from a threatened 32% earlier. It was finalized after talks with Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, and this deal now includes $15 billion in U.S. energy, $4.5 billion in agriculture, and 50 Boeing jets. At least 203 people have been killed in clashes in Syria's Suwaida province, including 92 members of the Druze minority and 21 civilians executed by the government forces, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The worsening fighting has prompted the deployment of additional government troops to the region. China's Vice Premier He Lifeng has warned that the world is facing turbulence and transformation as he opened a Beijing Expo today, where NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang is also expected to speak. According to media reports, Vice Premier also criticized certain countries for interfering in the market through tariffs and other measures. A Brazilian prosecutor has urged the Supreme Court to find former President Jair Bolsonaro guilty of plotting a coup, marking a major turning point in the high-profile trial. The case gained international attention after US President Donald Trump attempted to defend Bolsonaro. A group of Canada's First Nations has filed a constitutional challenge against new federal and Ontario laws that fast-track mining and pipeline projects, claiming they violate Indigenous self-determination rights. According to media reports, the laws represent a clear and present danger and undermine the government's duty to reconcile with Indigenous people. President Donald Trump has said Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky should not target Moscow, while publicly stating he is on nobody's side, and gave Russia a 50-day deadline to agree to a ceasefire or face sanctions, according to reports. Cuba's Labor Minister Marta Elena Feito resigned after public outrage over her claim that people eating from trash cans were disguised as beggars, a statement criticized by President Miguel Diaz-Canel for showing a lack of sensitivity, as Cuba now faces its worst economic crisis in 3 decades, with 350,000 people in vulnerable conditions. The US President Donald Trump has announced a new trade agreement with Indonesia. The move is part of a broader strategy to secure improved terms with key trading partners and address the United States' ongoing trade deficit. Indonesia's trade volume with the United States reached just under $40 billion in 2024. Although not among the top 15 U.S. trade partners, the bilateral trade relationship has shown steady growth. U.S. exports to Indonesia rose by 3.7% in 2024, while imports increased by 4.8%, leaving the U.S. with a trade goods deficit of nearly $18 billion. Meanwhile, Trump also indicated that trade negotiations with India are advancing. He said a potential agreement would grant American businesses greater access to India's vast consumer market. Indian officials have labeled this condition a non-negotiable red line, aimed at protecting both its citizens and millions of small-scale dairy farmers. Here's what the U.S. president had to say.
So we made a deal with Indonesia. I spoke to their really great president, very popular, very strong, smart, and we made the deal. We have full access to Indonesia, everything, As you know, Indonesia is very strong on copper, but we have full access to everything. We will pay no tariffs. So they are giving us access into Indonesia, which we never had. That's probably the biggest part of the deal. And the other part is they are going to pay 19%, and we are going to pay nothing. I think it's a good deal for both parties. But we will have full access into Indonesia. And we have a couple of those deals that are going to be announced. India basically is working along that same line. We're going to have access into India. And you have to understand, we had no access into any of these countries. Our people couldn't go in. And now we're getting access because of what we're doing with the tariffs. So they're paying 19%, and we are not paying anything. And they're going to give us full access into Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has some great product, and they also have some very valuable earths and various other materials. One of the things, as you know, they're known for is very high-quality copper, which we'll be using.
Now we're joined by guest Emma Long. She's an associate professor in American history and politics at University of East Anglia, as well as Dr. Ajay Dua. He's a former Secretary of Commerce and senior economist, joining us live from New Delhi. Welcome to NewsX World. And Emma, I would like to ask a question starting with you. With 15 billion in US energy and 50 Boeing jets included in this agreement, is this deal more about trade, or does it reflect deeper geopolitical alignment between Washington and Jakarta?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and thank you for having me on the program. The US trade with Indonesia is a relatively small part of America's international trade, somewhere around 1.5% of its GDP each year. So while that's not an insignificant amount, I think what we're seeing here is very much a President Trump playing up to the domestic issues that saw him get elected and the constituencies that he's trying to win over in the United States. So you heard him talk there about agricultural products. Sort of the farming community here in the United States has been strongly supportive of Trump, actually right since 2016, but have been putting pressure particularly for changes and things that would help the agricultural economy. So I think we see that there. Boeing, as I think we're all aware, has had a number of difficult years because of problems with its planes, among other things. So the emphasis particularly on Boeing airplanes, not just airplanes generally, I think is also sort of interesting for this. And sort of, again, thinking about Trump's rhetoric there, you know, he said repeatedly both about trade with Indonesia, but also with India, we've never had access. Well, of course, that's not actually true. So there's that element of sort of emphasizing what he wants people at home in the US to see as a win for the United States. The win is sort of in the political selling of it. Economically, we wait to see. And I think it's probably also worth saying that, as far as I'm aware, Indonesia has not confirmed the details that Trump has provided. So it may well be that he's claiming a narrative at this precise moment in time that may turn out to be slightly different when we hear from the other side.
Yes, and Emma, how might this deal impact President Trump's political narrative on trade heading into the election season? Is this a calculated move, according to you?
I mean, I don't think Trump does anything, despite the criticisms of him. I think he does things with a particular aim in mind. And I mean, the midterm elections are just over a year away, so there aren't immediate sort of electoral concerns, but we do know that Trump likes that sense of support that he gets. He likes the feeling that he's winning for the United States, for his constituency, for the people who voted for him. And you could hear it in the things that he said there and the way that he presented this deal, and also potentially a future deal with India. It fits with rhetoric that he has used around trade deals with the UK, for example, as well as other nations, as this kind of, he's leading the way, he is, he's negotiating these deals, he's sort of backing these countries down, by threatening these much higher tariffs and then sort of reducing them later on, which sort of is giving that sense that, we threatened this, but actually we got something out of it, and now it's much better than it was. So I think Trump always has one eye on getting his base or keeping his base happy.
Thank you very much, Emma Long, for sharing that insight. Now we move on with our other guest, Dr. Ajay Dua. Dr. Ajay, thank you for joining us today. From an economic standpoint, how significant is this new trade deal with Indonesia in addressing this U.S. trade deficit?
Good morning for having me on the show. I'm one with what the previous panelist, Professor Long, said about President Trump's motives and the way he's going about one-sidedly announcing trade pacts without really things being confirmed by the other party. And what bothers me is that even if two presidents agree on a certain thing on a phone call, a lot more work needs to be done to fill up, to flesh it out. Agreements do not come about by merely agreeing on the basis of an understanding. Months, weeks and months of work has to be done to list out the items on which there will be duty, on which there will be no duty, and what kind of existing constraints have to be removed. How do we classify items which have multi-use? A screw, a simple screw fastener can have a defense use, a civilian use, a use in agriculture, a use in industry. Each one of them, unless you have an agreement, you do not know once the item comes, how would it be dealt with at the customs of the two countries. Having said that, that's more of a procedural issue. I think if there is an agreement and the United States has been able to persuade the president of Indonesia that he should open up his market and allow full access to American products, it's something which the president of Indonesia will need to sell to his own electorate. After all, the major vocation in Indonesia is still primary. Agriculture, fisheries may not be so strong in dairy, and it is just going up the value chain in processing and manufacturing. Certainly, it's now also in primary products in minerals, which President Trump referred to more than once, copper and nickel. It is pretty strong. However, I think there is probably a little more to it, understandings, and it may be geopolitical, what you raised right in the beginning and when you asked Professor Long about it. That, yes, if there is a political deal and Indonesia wishes to, a strategic deal where it wishes to, or it being a short support by the United States in its security and other Indo-Pacific developments of the kind which are taking place, and with most countries of that region worried about an expansionist policy of China. So if that be so, then there is a price to pay. But if it is a straightforward trade deal, as interpreted by President Trump, it might take a little while for it to get into effect and for the details to be worked out.
And Dr. Ajay, regarding the potential U.S.-India trade agreement, how do conflicting priorities like U.S. market access versus India's protection of small-scale farmers complicate negotiations?
Yes, it would certainly, and that's been for us a red line: agriculture, and daring. After all, virtually half the population of the country, and we are a hugely populous country, as we know, about 1.45 billion people, if they depend upon agriculture and these primary professions, no government of the land can ever survive if politically and socially, if it does not protect them, look after their interests. And we've taken that position right through in even our negotiations in the different rounds of WTO. And it's not today's position. Ever since the first round of, well before even the Uruguay round, we had taken that for us. That's primary. We are not going to be opening up easily. But if selectively we need more apples, we need more American walnuts, American almonds, yes, we are willing to consider those. We need more of avocados coming from them, etc. What is not going to be hurting the Indian farmer, the horticulture in India is growing rapidly, but may not be in every fruit and every product. So those kind of things we are willing to look at, but if it's not purely going to be open up, like Indonesia seems to have said, we'll buy all agricultural products as per President Trump. We'll allow American dairy products to go there. Indonesia it may not have a strong base in dairy, but in India, we are the world's biggest producer of milk. We have not commercialized our dairy sector or the agriculture processing or agriculture growing. So we will continue to be concerned about these two sectors, and I think the United States will have to kind of bear with that, and yes, greater market access than before. So we had imposed certain duties on our processed goods, and manufacturers, because we also want to develop our manufacturing sector. We have that Make in India policy, or it's a different variation of what we've been following, import substitution policies or others for a very long time. But there certain concessions are needed to infuse to get to attract the Americans, because with them, if we exclude the services, we do have a merchandise surplus in our favor. But the kind of things we are negotiating with the United States on the defense side, on high technology, one or two deals there actually take care of the deficit, which is so much is being made of by the President of the United States. Having said that, to bring in competitiveness in the world trade, competitiveness in Indian economy, I think some amount of concession and lowering of import duties, tariffs by India would probably be agreed to, and rightly so, because over time it is free trade which builds the economies, builds the GDP, not protective measures.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajay Dua, for sharing that insight, and our other guest, Professor Emma Long, for joining us today. Please, Dr. Ajay, stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now we move on to our next news. US President Donald Trump has said that a trade agreement with Vietnam is nearly complete. This comes after the US President announced earlier this month that he had struck a preliminary trade deal with the communist country, which would cut planned US tariffs on imports from Vietnam to 20% from the 46% level he had threatened in April. At the time, Trump also said goods that Washington deemed to be illegally transshipped through Vietnam to other countries would be subject to a 40% levy. The agreement has not been finalized and details have not been released, leaving questions over how Washington will define an illegal transshipment and how much value Vietnam must add to imported products to avoid the 40% tariff. It also remains unclear which products would fall under Trump's 20% tariffs Vietnam has not confirmed the specific tariff rates, celebrating what it described as an agreement on a joint statement about a trade framework. Here's what the U.S. president had to say.
We have a Vietnam deal, and I would say that that deal is being pretty well set. Again, that's an opening of their country. They've opened it up. Just so you know, these were closed countries. They were wonderful people, wonderful leaders, very strong, smart leaders, but their countries were closed to us, but our country wasn't closed to them. And so I said, you got to open up your country. So we're going to see. But the Vietnam deal, we may open it. I mean, I don't know. I can't tell you. Is it necessary? Stop. Yeah, I don't think.
Now we're joined by Dr. Ajay Dua. He's a former Secretary of Commerce and senior economist. Thank you, Dr. Ajay, for staying with us. Now, what are the broader geopolitical implications of closer U.S.-Vietnam trade ties?
U.S. in
We might be facing some technical issues here. U.S. President Trump has said that a trade agreement with Vietnam is nearly complete. This comes after the U.S. President announced earlier this month that he has struck a preliminary trade deal with the communist country, which would cut planned U.S. tariffs on imports from Vietnam to 20% to the 46% from the 46% level he had threatened back in April. At the time, Trump also said goods that Washington deemed to be illegally transshipped through Vietnam to other countries would be subject to a 40% levy. The agreement has not been finalized and details have not been released, leaving questions over how Washington will define an illegal transshipment and how much value Vietnam must add to imported products to avoid the 40% tariff. It also remains unclear which products would fall under Trump's 20% tariff. Vietnam has not confirmed the specific tariff rates, celebrating what it described as an agreement on a joint statement about the trade framework. U.S. President Trump has that a trade agreement with Vietnam is nearly complete. This comes after the U.S. President announced earlier this month that he had struck a preliminary trade deal with the communist country, which would cut planned U.S. tariffs on imports from Vietnam to 20% from the 46% level he had threatened back in April. At the time, Trump also said goods that Washington deemed to be illegally transshipped through Vietnam to other countries would be subject to a 40% levy. Now we move on to our next news. The death toll from violence in southern Syria's Suwaida province has risen to 203. According to a war monitor, among the dead are Druze civilians, Bedouin fighters, and security personnel. The Syrian government forces have been accused of carrying out summary executions in Druze areas. Local Druze residents said that the government mission meant to restore order devolved into looting, arson, and executions. Meanwhile, Israel launched strikes on Syrian military targets for a second day, citing the need to maintain a demilitarized zone and protect the Druze community. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel is acting to prevent harm to Druze residents. Let's listen in to his comments.
אנחנו פועלים גם בסוריה היום, מהבוקר. יש לנו מחויבות לשמור על אזור דרום מערב סוריה כשטח מפורז בגבול ישראל. אנחנו לא נרשה לחזור למצב שמקיימים לנו שם לבנון שנייה. ואנחנו גם מחויבים לשמור על התושבים הדרוזים. אנחנו עושים זאת באמצעות פעולות עצימות. אני מקווה שלא נצטרך לפעול יותר. זה תלוי מאוד במה שמבינים וגם עושים וגם לא עושים.
Damascus has condemned these strikes, with Syrian Foreign Ministry holding Israel fully responsible for the attacks and their consequences. The ministry further stressed Syria's commitment to protecting all citizens, including the Druze, and affirmed its right to defend its territory under international law. Additionally, the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, called the clashes worrisome and said Washington was working with all parties to restore calm. Now we're joined by Jordan Cope. He's a Middle East expert joining us live from Germany. Thank you, Jordan, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, what does the alleged involvement of Syrian government forces in these executions indicate about Damascus's control and strategy in Druze majority areas? Jordan, you might be muted.
I'm not. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, thank you.
When it comes to war, there's often a fog that comes therewith, and it takes often time to truly assess the situation on the ground. However, based off of open source intelligence and videos coming from the As-Suwaida governorate, it's very concerning, the scenes that I've at least seen. I've seen Syrian government supporters and members of the Syrian government partaking in acts that many might consider to actually be war crimes. Footage of militia members or members of the Syrian government forcefully taking Druze captives and shaving off their mustaches, which maintain religious and cultural importance within their tradition, degrading and humiliating treatment of Druze captives, kicking them and punching them in the face, forcing them to bark like dogs and capturing it in recording, not to mention reports alleging that approximately 200 people have been killed, many of those perhaps even by summary execution, which of course is against international law and the laws of warfare. So it's very concerning to see what's going on the ground in As-Suwaida, not to mention that the forces actually really began to invade, to control areas and to ultimately conquer As-Suwaida until Israel's intervention, which the world otherwise watched and stood by doing nothing before Israel took it upon its own initiative to save an ethnic minority group across the border. Very concerning scenes that we've seen from the Syrian government. And it's not ultimately a surprise, however, even though the West has cozied up to the Ashara regime, one must not forget how Ashara refused to rein in his forces and his supporters, who ultimately massacred approximately 1,300 Alawites, a group, an offshoot of the Shiite Islam faith, and a minority also in Syria. Not to mention, the Kurds in the north have also been attacked by Syrian government forces and have lost territory to the Ashara regime. And so these minority groups, which control de facto territory and defend their own, understanding that the Syrian government shouldn't be left to its devices to protect these minority groups, which it has failed to protect and has even attacked. It's ultimately a very concerning situation on the ground, and without Israel's intervention, it could have been much, much worse.
And Jordan, with multiple actors, as we know, are involved in this tragic accident that has happened, and including local militias, as well as Israel, how likely is it that the situation in Sweden could escalate into a wider conflict or draw in outside powers?
It seems like Syria ultimately is still very concerned in feigning a reformed attitude to Western countries, which are very vested in seeing Syria and Israel normalize. And a very weird situation we're seeing unraveling, even though tensions are developing between Syria and Israel. At the same time, we're also seeing advances by both countries, potentially towards a security agreement or even normalization. Well, obviously, one of the biggest obstacles to normalization or to a security agreement, which might even be discussed in Baku with Syrian and Israeli officials meeting this upcoming weekend, one of the biggest obstacles is the future of southern Syria and Israel's ability to intervene, whether it be against terrorist groups or whether it be against the Syrian government, if Israel perceives the government to be acting in a manner that could potentially implicate future ethnic cleansing against the Druze people. So it remains yet to be seen, really, how what is occurring in southern Syria will and how it will evolve, given that this is the first instance, really, of Ashar's regime actually intervening on the ground in southern Syria. However, all of this being said, Syria has acknowledged at the same time that it is not important for it to recover the Golan Heights in a future normalization agreement, as well as Mount Hermon, which poses significant geographic and strategic importance for Israel, being the high ground in a very volatile region. So it remains yet to be seen ultimately what will happen. I do not predict this turning into a greater regional concern. However, what is important right now is that the Druze people are protected for yet another day, and the world has much gratitude to thank Israel for intervening.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us today and sharing your insight as a Middle East expert. Now we move on to our next news. At least 93 Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Another 278 people were reportedly wounded on Tuesday as Israeli ground operations continued. The ministry did not specify the number of combatants among the dead, but local officials said dozens of women and children were among the victims. One strike in northern Gaza's Shati refugee camp killed a Hamas legislator, a man, a woman, and their 6 children. Another strike in Tel Aviv killed 19 members of a single family. The Israeli military has not commented on these strikes. The IDF urged Gaza City and Jabalia residents to flee southward amid ongoing offensives. The military announced the demolition of a 3.5-kilometer Hamas tunnel and claimed to have killed dozens of terrorists while destroying infrastructure in a joint operation. Now we're joined by Professor Rohan Gunaratna. He's an international security expert joining us live from Singapore. Thank you, Professor Rohan, for joining us today. Good to see you. How does this killing of a Hamas legislator alongside civilians in refugee camps impact the classification of these strikes? Are these legitimate military targets, or do they risk being seen as indiscriminate attacks? Professor, could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, let me repeat the question. So, how does this killing of a Hamas legislator alongside civilians impact the classification of these strikes?
What we have seen is a significant rise in violence. And this violence, we cannot blame the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. We can't blame any other party except Hamas, because this devastating war was caused by a Hamas terrorist attack. If Hamas releases the hostages, if Hamas disarms, and if Hamas surrenders, this war will end. Otherwise, there will be persistent losses of Palestinian civilians. So I believe that all governments should work towards a permanent resolution of this conflict. Otherwise, the terrain, the challenges that are facing, especially of maintaining law and order where there are humanitarian and food supplies, I think that all these things can be done if there comes a point where there is a willingness and sufficient pressure on Hamas to surrender, disarm, and release the hostages.
And Professor, with no official comment from the Israeli military yet, how important is transparency and intelligence sharing in maintaining international credibility during such operations?
Certainly, Israel has been quite transparent. It has already informed very clearly its objective. That is, Gaza needs to be Hamas free, threat free, so that Israel will not suffer another attack. But again, rather than sharing intelligence, I think what is important is to share information of what is happening on the ground and what can be done to minimize civilian deaths, because civilian deaths is what we have to stop, what we have to reduce. Of course, every war produces civilian deaths, but in this case, it is largely because Hamas is playing a hide and seek game where it has infiltrated civilian organizations. It is using places of religious worships, schools, hospitals to hide and fight. And, and because of the deceptive nature of Hamas, the blame for the civilian deaths should be on Hamas, not on Israel.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on the topic. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has warned that the bloc may take action against Israel if conditions in Gaza don't improve. She has outlined 10 options, including trade restrictions, sanctions on Israeli ministers, and an arms embargo after Israel was found to have breached a cooperation agreement on human rights. At a meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels, no consensus was reached to take any of these steps, but Kaja Kallas stressed that the options remain on the table. Kallas said the goal is to improve the humanitarian situation, not to punish Israel. The war in Gaza began after Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack. The Hamas-run health ministry says over 58,000 Palestinians have been killed so far. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Rohan Gunaratna. He's an international security expert. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. How serious are Kaja Kallas's proposed measures, including these trade restrictions and arms embargo, in terms of potential impact on Israel's military as well as diplomatic posture?
I personally believe that Israel has all the right to defend itself, because Israel suffered one of the most devastating attacks, October 7th and 8th, 2023, where 251 Israeli and foreign nationals were taken hostage. And of course, a very large number of Israelis and foreigners were killed in the Hamas-led attack. So it is so important for the international community to first to defend the right of Israelis, of IDF to defend its own citizens. Second is, of course, we have to have a long-term strategic plan to create a two-state solutions where the Palestinians can live in peace. But this business of doing terrorism, of killing, maiming, injuring people, raping people, all of which Hamas did, has to stop. As long as this is a part of the modus operandi of Hamas, Hamas should have no place to hide. So what should be built globally is that ethic against violence, against political violence, and also against war crimes. Governments themselves have to be very careful in their operations to ensure civilians do not die. But unfortunately, because city beneath Gaza has been created, we have seen it has been very difficult for the IDF to locate the terrorists, to locate their own hostages. So because of that, there has been civilian death. So one should understand the terrain, one should understand the situation on the ground before one takes actions against Israel.
And Professor, what legal and political mechanisms would the EU need to activate in order to impose those sanctions?
I think the European Union has a very good mechanism for assessing threats, assessing risks, and then imposing sanctions, whether it is against any country. So I think that all these governments that are under pressure should work with the EU mechanism, but make sure that national security is preserved for Israel, and also the sanctions mechanism should be effective. Otherwise, these sanctions are not going to be something fruitful and beneficial. but Israel's right to defend itself should not be compromised in any way, because it's a very small country in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, and it is key to preserve their national security, national interests when it comes to taking actions.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Israeli protesters gathered outside the Tel Aviv Expo Center as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attended an event on local governance. They called for an end to the war in Gaza and for Netanyahu to step down, while also expressing support for Attorney General Baharav-Miara, who has clashed with the government over legal issues and faces calls for dismissal. The protests come amid growing fatigue over the war in Gaza. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Rohan Gunaratna. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, what does the growing wave of domestic protests calling for an end to the Gaza war, as well as Netanyahu's resignation, reveal about the Israeli government's failure to manage both the military conflict and public morale within the country?
There is a surge of opposition within Israel against Netanyahu. But one must consider two aspects. One is that even if there are protests, it is important for Hamas to be disarmed, to make sure they surrender and release the hostages. Otherwise, it will be a very temporary gain. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the other terrorist groups will attack Israel again. So I think the protesters themselves need to be educated that these protests are not going to prevent Israel from securing its interests and its national security. But certainly this education engagement is imperative. Otherwise, it will become increasingly difficult for IDF to maintain, the Israeli Defense Forces to maintain the momentum of operations, which should continue until their own nationals are released or though their own nationals are rescued. So at this point, I believe that there needs to be greater effort on the part of the international community to better understand that this devastating war in Gaza is caused by a very brutal terrorist attack in 2023, October 7th and 8th.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we move on to our next news. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that Iran is eager to engage in talks. This comes after the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear sites last month. Let's listen to what he has said.
Guys, you at Iran, have you seen any progress in talks with Iran? We haven't really heard about that in a while.
Well, they want to talk. I'm in no rush to talk. They would like to talk. I'm in no rush to talk because we obliterated their site. They'd have to start all over. In fact, it's obliterated to the point that it's not usable anymore. They'd have to pick a different mountain.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, alongside the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and the UK, set a de facto deadline of the end of August to reach a nuclear deal with Iran. If no agreement is made by then, European powers plan to trigger the snapback mechanism, reimposing all UN sanctions lifted under the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now we move on to our next news. U.S. President Donald Trump has stated that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky should refrain from targeting Moscow, despite previously encouraging Ukraine to step up strikes on Russia. President Trump has confirmed that shipments of military aid. Let's listen into what he has said.
When do you think the first Patriot missiles, some of these weapons that our allies will buy?
They're already being shipped.
From what countries?
They're coming in from Germany and then replaced by Germany, and in all cases, the United States gets paid back in full.
We're going to see what happens with President Putin, Trump has said, expressing frustration that the Russian leader has not lived up to his claims of wanting peace. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte acknowledged that discussions are still underway regarding longer-range weapons for Ukraine. He also warned about countries facing sanctions. Let's listen in to what he has said.
With that sanctions bill saying, listen, if you are the president of China or the prime minister of India or the president of Brazil and you're still trading with the Russians and getting the oil and the gas in and you sometimes even resell it for a higher price, know that if this guy in Moscow doesn't get serious about peace talks, I will slam secondary sanctions on you of 100%. So I'm sure they don't know yet what hit them. This will take some time to sink in, and I think you guys making this clear in the media, the senators maybe also discussing this with their counterparts in Brazil, India, China, will be very helpful to put maximum pressure on Russia in addition to the weapons delivery into Ukraine.
Rutte, alongside U.S. senators, welcomed Trump's tougher stance against Moscow, underscoring the pressure on Russia to negotiate a ceasefire. With just 50 days to reach a deal, the stakes are higher than ever as global powers brace for further escalation. Now we're joined by Shruti Das Gupta. She's an international affairs expert joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you, Shruti, for joining us today. Good to see you. How do you interpret President Trump's shift from encouraging Ukraine to strike Russia and now advising Zelensky not to target Moscow while thinking about more arms aid to Ukraine?
Greetings, Asuma. Thank you for inviting me. Trump wants to bring an end to the Ukraine-Russia war, but not really. Like, he would like it to happen, but it is definitely funding his military-industrial complex, and in a big way. As we've just heard in your earlier report, he's asking Patriot missile systems that are in Germany that to be restationed into Ukraine, and EU is going to pay for it, which is exactly what led Kaja Kallas to ask US to share the burden by stating that if you're saying you're giving the weapons, but you're asking EU to pay for it, it doesn't really mean that you're giving the weapons, you're just selling it to them. So for now, it looks like Trump wants to sell more weapons, and that in a way encourages manufacturing in US, and it brings in lots and lots and billions of dollars and makes him look good. While he talks of being on the side of humanity, he is selling bombs, missiles, attacking equipment. He says he wants to be on the side of peace, but you've never seen a man who talks of peace and drops bombs on countries left, right, and center. So Trump is trying to put Putin in a corner by supplying more and more money, earning the goodwill of his own lobbies, arms lobbies inside USA, while doing the pretense of talking peace with Putin. Moscow on its own is feeling as if they've been put on a deadline, are being used by Trump to play this pull and push game with EU, with Ukraine, and their own arms lobby. So it's a very murky situation, and I don't feel Trump is on any other side except his own.
And now, given Trump's confirmation of continued military aid shipments, how might this affect the balance between supporting Ukraine's defense aid and then avoiding escalation with Russia? How do you think might these statements come across to Russia and Russia's perception of US?
Well, Russia's already been betrayed by USA once when that entire Operation Spiderweb happened. That was an 18-month-long operation in planning, and that means that the Biden administration had already leaked confidential information to Zelensky and had helped them plan out a very devious, insidious attack on Russia itself. And that was part of their South One program, where between US and Russia during the mutual nuclear disarmament deals, they had told each other where their nuclear bombing planes would be, and those planes were supposed to be on site, available via geosatellites to each other so that they can keep a track of each other and have a sense of faith. So this was a break of faith by the US under Biden administration, for which Trump had to take the brunt. So right now, Moscow is not feeling too good about it, and being pressured into a corner with the deadlines of 50 days and additional sanctions, they don't spell as a man who wants camaraderie anymore. It means a man who wants to dictate terms. So Moscow is not going to be very happy about it, and Putin doesn't really respond well to such kind of pressure tactics. you might just see an escalation towards Zelensky and his Ukraine rather than a de-escalation as a result of all these pressure tactics.
Thank you very much, Shruti Das Gupta, for joining us today and sharing your insight as an international affairs expert. Now, well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.